Welcome to UC Science Radio, where we conduct interviews with a range of scientists to learn about the big issues facing our world and what science is doing to help. I'm Molly McGidd, a master's student in the School of Biological Sciences. Today I'm talking with Dr. Sally Gaw. She's an environmental chemist, associate professor in chemistry, and the director of environmental science at UC. Her research focuses on contaminants in the environment. Sally is passionate about creating evidence-based policy to protect the health of the environment, organisms, and people of New Zealand. Chiara, Sally, thanks for coming on UC Science Radio. I'm interested in what your role is at UC and what's your research on.
Well, thank you for the invitation. I am an environmental chemist and I'm employed in the College of Science. I teach in the chemistry program, which is my home school, the School of Physical and Chemical Sciences. But I also am the director of environmental science, which is run out of the School of Earth and Environment. So I work across the university. I have taught programs in engineering. I have taught in programs across science. So I have taught chemistry courses into some of the Antarctic courses, the water resource management courses, the environmental science courses. And my expertise and interest is in understanding where chemicals come from and where they might go and what kind of impacts they might have. I'm particularly interested in understanding how our everyday lives contribute to environmental contamination. So we sort of have that idea of that there is contamination in the environment and it's got nothing to do with us. You know, it's industry, it's farming, it's someone else. But in actual fact, many of the reasons that we have environmental contamination is because goods or activities are occurring that benefit our everyday lives. So I'm interested in that space.
So where are these chemicals coming from and how are they getting into water streams?
Well, if you think about what happens, we have resources come into our cities and we use them in some way. So that can be water coming in, that can be energy coming in to keep our houses warm, keep our lights on. It's the clothing and things that we import. So we have a whole lot of resources and things that we need to lead the lives that we lead. And as we use them and as we do things with them, then either during the processing and the manufacturing of those resources or the gathering of those resources, or as we use them or at the end of their life, then environmental contamination will occur. So if you think about, for example, something that probably everybody's used today, which is soap, there will have been contaminants or environmental issues created during the production of that soap. We then use it in our house, depending on what's in that soap. We then use it on our clothes, or we might use it on our bodies. We wash something with it. Residues then end up in wastewater, which ends up in the sewers, which then ends up in a wastewater treatment plant. If there's something in that soap that the wastewater treatment plant is not able to process or remove, then that will end up either in the biosolids, so the solid stuff left over after wastewater treatment, which is often used as a resource somewhere else in the environment, or in the water that's released from the wastewater treatment plant. If along the way we actually use that soap outside and we use it to wash our cars, then that could then run off the car and onto the road and then end up in stormwater, and here in Christchurch end up in one of our streams and ultimately out in some kind of sea, and out in the ocean, out in the estuaries, out in the harbour, somewhere like that. Or if we have something that's collected and ends up in a wastewater treatment plant, or should end up in a wastewater treatment plant, but there's a break somewhere in the pipes, then that can also be released into the environment.
What sorts of issues happen when chemicals like that end up in the ocean or in streams?
Well, there's a range of different issues that can happen. So I'm interested in the class that's called emerging contaminants. So that's contaminants that we're starting to think we need to think about those, and that's either because we know more about them, and sometimes it now means that we can actually measure them in the environment, or we know something more about their toxicity. So I'm interested in the ones that we don't know very much about, and so we may not know the effects that they might have, or we know that they might impact on aquatic organisms in some way, that they may be toxic. They may accumulate in sediments. Some of the chemicals that they break down into may be more toxic than where we even started from. And one of the other contaminants that I'm working on in that space is microplastics. So when we release plastic out into the environment. And that often can be used in personal care products, though that is increasingly being controlled.
So are there things that individuals can do to limit the chemicals that they put out? Or is it a thing that industries or the government has to change in terms of banning the use of certain chemicals?
I think it's a multiple approach. So if you think of something like microbeads, which were in personal care products, They were used sort of as skin exfoliants. They've been removed. Now, they were ultimately removed because the government brought in some legislation to say we wouldn't have them anymore. But there was consumer pressure. There was some good research done in universities that said, we have these here. And some of the work we've been doing, we think we've found microbeads out in the environment, which is very exciting for us, not for the environment. And so there was sort of that double edge of people saying, we're not happy about this, we're not comfortable about this. This then the government picks it up as an issue and says, well, actually, we're not going to do that anymore. So it's sort of a two-way thing. You have regulation, but often you need the science and the information to say there might be a problem. You need enough of a community concern or a raise to say, hey, we'd actually really like this to be relooked at. So we'd like our regulatory agencies to have another look at it. And then ultimately, you need the government to make the rules to say we aren't going to do that anymore. Now, that's something that I think we need to improve on in New Zealand, is understanding what chemicals come into New Zealand in products. We're very good at regulating and managing chemicals that come in as a chemical. So if it comes in a drum or comes in a bucket and is labelled as a chemical, then it is well regulated. We don't have so much information that comes into New Zealand as part of something that is manufactured. So if you think about your sofa or your car or your computer, there's actually quite a lot of chemicals in there that are used to produce that. And we don't have a good handle on what they are or what quantities there are.
You mentioned a little bit about microplastics. Could you explain what microplastics are and how they form?
Sure. So microplastics are small items of plastic that are less than, we'll say 5 millimeters. There's some variation in what different definitions are. So they're less than 5 millimeters in diameter. Now they can either be primary mass microplastics. So those are microplastics that are produced as microplastics. So that might have been exfoliants that you would put in it that would be in skincare products. They might be used in air blasting or spray blasting for sort of industrial applications, or they may even be the pellets that are used. So most of the plastic that comes into New Zealand comes in as small plastic pellets or small plastic beads, and they get melted down and then they get made into lunch boxes and drink bottles and whatever we make into plastic. So those are the primary microplastics. Those are easier to control. Then we have the secondary microplastics, and these will be a nightmare to control. So these are the small pieces of plastic that are produced from the breakdown of larger plastic items. So your tires on the road will produce microplastics. Litter that gets released into the environment will break down and form plastics. Another form of these are the microfibers that are produced when we wash clothing made of synthetic materials, so nylon, polyester, polypropylene. And so these are produced in the environment either by sort of physical breaking down processes, sunlight. If you think if you've got something sitting on the beach being dragged up and down the beach in the sand, then that will also cause small bits to shave off.
I think people are used to thinking of trash in the ocean as big pieces of plastic that maybe get stuck around an animal's neck or in their nostril or something like that, and that's clearly harmful. But what do these microplastics do when wildlife interact with them?
So you're right, there's a very lot of plastic out there that is not easy to see until you start looking for it. And you can be surprised. I've seen some samples and you sort of looked on the beach and then you think, well, I've seen a couple of bits, and then my students processing them and you find out there's actually a lot more in there than we thought. So one of the problems, the first thing is that for many organisms is these can look like food. All organisms are filter feeders, so the way they feed is they suck water through and they take out the big bits and they break them down. When they get these plastic bits inside them, it can do them some damage because they might be a bit abrasive or they might cut them in some way or do something. The other problem is they get a false feeling of being full because their stomachs or their gastrointestinal tracts are now lined chock-a-block with these small bits of plastic. So then they're not feeding. So then they sort of lose body condition, they're not getting the nutrients, they can't grow, they can't reproduce. So that's sort of one of the concerns. The other problem is that plastics aren't always very benign. When we make a lot of plastic items, we often have chemical additives added to them. There is some concern that those chemical additives may be toxic. So not all plastic is kind of like what you'd expect in your lunchbox and it's food safe. There are other things in there. So I've got my computer sitting on my knee while I'm talking to you. You know, there's going to be a whole lot of flame retardants. There's going to be other additives in there that are going to stop the plastic breaking down and my computer staying like a computer. So there is concern about when those plastics get out in the environment, then those chemicals leach out into the organisms. Finally, there started being concern about the really, really small plastics and whether they can cross barriers and cross cell lines and move around inside an organism, causing damage as they do so.
And is there a human health concern around eating the creatures that may have ingested plastic?
At the moment, I think that's a big question mark, and people are still working through, and I'm involved in a couple of projects that will be looking at that space. We are exposed to so much plastic in our everyday lives. Most people use a plastic toothbrush. We drink out of plastic containers. People probably chew on their pens while they're thinking. There's so much plastic, it's really hard to tell. And there's an interesting Irish study where they created meals that had seafood in them, and they compared the microplastics that were just in the meal versus if you left the meal out for the kind of time that someone would be eating, of what kind of came out of their house and added to it. And they found that there was a much, much bigger exposure from sort of the dust and things in their house while you were eating your meal than there was just from the seafood component. So this is really a space where there's a big question mark.
And you were talking about all the products that are made of plastic or have plastic in them. Why is plastic used so much in our products?
Well, it is a bit of a wonder material. It's very strong, it's lightweight. There's some of the advantages in using it for packaging because it's waterproof. In some cases, it will keep food safer for longer. By having lighter packaging compared to, say, having glass bottles for milk, then there's some gains in terms of energy, in terms of transport, and it's not so heavy. There's many, many advantages to plastic. But one of the problems is we're quite often using a very permanent material for very short-term uses. So these single-use plastics, I think, are one of the first things we really need to think about. We're talking about very permanent materials that will last for a very, very long time, and we often use them for less than half an hour. So I think that's part of our problem, is that we are using plastic so indiscriminately. We're using so much of it, and there will be applications in spaces. And we've done this with all sorts of other materials and other products through time, of working out, well, this is a really great material, but we're only going to use it for these uses. And when we do that, we're going to use it in certain ways so we can recycle it or reuse it more easily. One of the things that limits recycling at the moment is that some plastics are more difficult than others to recycle, and it's definitely difficult to recycle things when plastic items are made out of 2 or 3 different kinds of plastic. So if you look at a drink bottle or many, many things that are made out of plastic, you actually see there's actually 2 or 3 different types of plastic there. And that becomes a problem for recycling, because sometimes you just can't melt the whole lot down, because when you try to do that, you're just going to make a mess because those 3 plastics are not going to melt together.
I know there was a plastic bag ban that started in July of last year. Do you think things like that are helping to reduce plastic use?
I think so. And they're also getting people to think about, do I really need something that's single use? And I think that's been quite useful to actually sort of think about what is an appropriate thing to use. Plastic was making up quite a significant proportion of our landfills. It's a very lightweight material, and it's very tricky to manage in a landfill setting, because particularly plastic bags and things like that, because they can blow away. So anything where people start thinking about single-use plastics and sort of designing them out is a really good idea. There's also other benefits because of the amount of energy that goes into making plastics, and then we've got to deal with them when you throw them out, and you've got to deal with them forever. And I'm also thinking about plastic novelty items and plastic giveaways and things, plastic Happy Meal toys and those sorts of things. Really thinking about whether that is an appropriate use. And I think it's going to come down to some conversations as a community of what is a good use of plastic, what is a frivolous use of plastic, and what is an appropriate use of a material, because it is a valuable and useful material. I'm quite happy that whenever I have a medical procedure, that the syringes that are used on me are single-use plastic. That I think is an important use. Whether having a plastic lid on a takeaway coffee cup is a good use or not is something that we need to talk about.
So something I've been thinking about during this time is the use of things like antimicrobials or antibacterial soap, which people may be using potentially at a higher rate during a time of pandemic. First of all, what harm can antibacterials or antimicrobials do if they end up in the rivers or in the ocean? And then second, how is there a balance between people trying to think about their health and preserving the environment?
So the first thing I want to say is that the available evidence is that in controlling disease at home, ordinary soap and water is as good as antimicrobial compounds. That's the evidence that is out there. Now, whether that applies for the particular virus we're talking about now, I don't think anybody knows. But the evidence says good washing and drying your hands properly, and the drying is really important, is as good. So there have been some studies done looking at, in non-clinical settings at home, how well do they work. Antimicrobial compounds are problematic for a few reasons. One, when they go out in the environment, they're antimicrobials, so they work on things, on microbial things. So antimicrobials such as triclosan and some of the others have been shown to impact on algae, which are the primary producers. They are the little engines at the bottom of the food chain that collect all of the energy from the sun. They are photosynthetic organisms often. They produce the food for everybody else. And so there is evidence that antimicrobial compounds will change how much you have, which organisms you have, and so could potentially have follow-on impacts on food chains. The other problem with antimicrobial compounds is we are getting problems with antimicrobial resistance. So bacteria becoming resistant to pharmaceuticals that we would really rather that they didn't. And it's been shown that some of the antimicrobial compounds that we can use and we can use at home would contribute to the development of antimicrobial resistance. So by not using antimicrobial compounds when you don't need to use them actually contributes to protecting your health. Now, the problem with antimicrobial resistance is that one group of bacteria can develop defense mechanisms about antimicrobials. But what happens is bacteria have a really nifty trick, and I wish someone could do this for me with calculus, in that they can share the genetic material they have. So once they've figured out how to work around an antimicrobial compound, and often that mechanism will be the same that they would work against an antibiotic, they can then give that information over to a bacteria that might be able to make us sick, so a pathogenic bacteria. So we need to be a little bit careful about antimicrobials, that we're using them in the right way and we're not making things worse for ourselves. So that's why I don't use antibacterial or antimicrobial soaps and things at home, because I'm concerned about the human health impacts of some of those as well. And so, I'm the one who shouts at the television at home when you see, they have the stereotype of the mother cleaning the kitchen with an antimicrobial wipe and she's protecting her family. And in actual fact, that may not be protecting her family, that actually may be something that could in the long run cause more harm.
So backing up a bit, what was your path to this research?
Well, from about the age of 16, I wanted to be an environmental chemist. So it's just as well that now I've